This program contains content that may disturb some viewers.
Innocent children sexually abused by the clergy.
And it came to a head when the priest was going into the boys' toilets several times a day.
Then the church's legal attack began.
Firstly, they disputed that the abuse had occurred.
It's a betrayal of trust that has shaken the very foundation of the church.
It's not only a crisis of scandal and crime, it's also a crisis of faith and credibility.
How the Catholic Church used the law to hide its sins. Welcome to the program. A great deal of shocking revelation of systematic institutional abuse of children over many decades has by now washed through the various official inquiries into child abuse in Australia. But if you think by now you've heard it all, you haven't. Some of the great iconic pillars of virtue have been sucked into the vortex of scandal in the process, none more so than the Catholic Church. Earlier this year, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Abuse scrutinised the Catholic Church's nationwide policy on the issue, called Towards Healing. One case in particular, that of abuse victim John Ellis, exposed a history of heavy-handed legal tactics by the Sydney Archdiocese. Next week, the scrutiny turns to Melbourne and a strategy set up by its then Archbishop George Pell in 1996. It's inevitable that the Royal Commission will again zero in on the Church's legalistic pressure tactics in its dealings with victims. And again, as new evidence we present tonight will show, the Church hierarchy and its lawyers are likely to be facing serious questions on their past actions. Quentin McDermott reports.
It's Saturday evening at St Mary of the Angels Basilica in Geelong, and Father Kevin Dillon is getting ready for Mass. If there's one topic here in Victoria that's sacred, it's football.
Freo being done by St Kilda. It's only the second quarter though. Cats playing GWS?
As with other Catholic congregations around Australia, attendances are down and many of the pews lie empty. It's a sign of the deep distress felt by the faithful at the Church's litany of sex crimes, and more than that, of the Church's abject failure to respond appropriately.
A lot of people are looking for care and support from within the Church, and the horrific thing is when they have looked for it, they have found it wanting, and they've still been left in dire straits.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Father Dillon's answer has been to set up a victim support group called Lifeboat.
The prime purpose of Lifeboat is to say to the people, you matter, we care about you, and we will do what we can to help you, because the Lifeboat, when you were assaulted by a church person, be it a priest or a brother or whoever, the lifeboat of connection with God went down with the ship. This is our little effort in our own small way to put that lifeboat up again.
But Father Dillon's mission stands in stark contrast to a Catholic hierarchy which for years has employed teams of lawyers to fight victims in the courts and minimise the Church's exposure to damages.
It's been a misguided attempt to preserve the Church's assets and the Church's reputation.
Behold the Lamb of God.
But the real assets of the Church are its people. Those assets have been damaged many cases irreparably, not just the victims and not just their families, but so many people who've looked upon this horrific saga and have voted with their feet. The awful thing is it didn't have to happen this way.
Why it did happen this way and why the Church treated victims in the way it did is now being forensically examined at the Royal Commission. And the Church's legal strategy is front and centre in that examination.
In a legal sense, we always acted honestly, and I believe in a legal sense there was nothing done that was improper.
John Ellis was 14 years old when he first became a victim of clergy sexual abuse. 40 years later, the pain remains etched in his face. Father Aidan Duggan, his abuser, was a priest in his 50s who at first he admired and trusted.
My name is John Andrew Ellis and I'm a solicitor.
In March, John Ellis told his story to the Royal Commission.
I was ashamed of what was happening and I knew that it was meant to be secret.
We've set up this practice based on John's...
Years after these events, John Ellis, by now a successful solicitor, suffered a severe traumatic reaction to his childhood abuse. Looking for help and support, he approached the Catholic Church's Towards Healing programme and disclosed what had occurred. But the senior churchman's response seemed inappropriate.
He was telling me that it was, all a long time ago and that, the police were probably not going to be very interested in that and really there wasn't much could be done about it and, they did have a process but, it might be best, all things considered, to just go away and move on with my life.
John Ellis pressed the Church to accept his story, and in 2003 a church assessor decided that more likely than not the abuse had occurred and had damaged his mental, physical and emotional health.
So, as I think you probably know...
With his health in decline, John Ellis lost his high-paying legal job and requested $100,000 in compensation for the harm done to him in childhood by the Church. But he was offered just $30,000 with a catch.
I was told that, by the way, you need to sign a deed of release and sign off your legal rights before we'll pay you this money. The other thing...
John Ellis felt he was left with no choice but to lodge a claim in court.
Looking back at it, I can say, hand on heart, that I might have been prepared to accept their payment of $30,000 if they'd actually treated me with respect.
As John was saying in that process...
Instead, the decision was taken to fight John Ellis's claim and fight it hard, as a win against him would protect the Church's assets against claims from other victims.
That was a deliberate strategy to send a message to people, don't come after the Church.
George Pell, then Archbishop of Sydney, had handpicked a firm of solicitors, Cause Chambers Westgarth, to fight the case. And this internal email show the Archbishop's private secretary, Dr. Michael Casey, commenting approvingly, "I think they're approaching it the right way to knock Ellis out."
They had a decision to make, whether to deal with the claim ethically and justly and compassionately, or whether to take a hard line and knock me out. Dr. Casey's email was affirming the instructions that the latter and more shameful course was the one that had been chosen by the Church. The paragraph should read...
Remarkably, Archbishop Pell's instructions to his team were to set aside the Church's own assessment that John Ellis was telling the truth. As a result, John Ellis was subjected to days of cross-examination in court about his private life and whether the abuse had occurred.
The dagger to the heart really was when the question was put about whether these things really happened. and the suggestion was made that I was somehow making the whole thing up. I think really from that point in time there was no turning back for me. I couldn't have any trust in the church as an institution once that was done.
Well, I think it's only a portion of the cross-examination.
At the Royal Commission, the Catholic Church's lawyers were grilled about the legal and moral stance they'd taken in attacking Ellis.
It's a fundamental challenge to Mr. Ellis, and it shouldn't have happened, should it?
On reflection, probably not.
Mr. Dowles, we've got the transcript. You sat there while your counsel put in issue whether or not Mr. Ellis was telling the truth about having been abused. That's the position, isn't it?
It is, Your Honour.
Can you explain how ethically you could sit there and do that?
Your Honour, I don't think it was ever put to Mr. Ellis that he was lying about the abuse.
Cardinal Cors weren't your moral advisors, were they?
No, they received instructions from me on this point, and they said that the option that they recommended to us was legally proper.
At the heart of the Church's defence was the argument that the Church's trustees only deal with property and can't be held liable for the criminal actions of priests. It became known as the Ellis defence, and it meant that there was no one John Ellis could sue, because by now Father Duggan, his abuser, was dead. It makes the senior hierarchy, it makes the bishops and archbishops look like very slippery characters, legally speaking.
Times have changed now, and what's abundantly clear is that the Catholic Church needs to demonstrate to the community its genuine bona fides, that the interests of victims is paramount, and that they need to provide victims who want to bring a case for damages against the Church, they need to provide them with a legal entity to sue.
In 2007, John Ellis lost his bid to take his case to the High Court and was handed a bill for costs of more than $500,000. The Church, through its lawyers Cause Chambers Westgarth, continued to pursue him for payment even after being told that his health had deteriorated further. It took 3 years for the Archdiocese of Sydney to relent and waive the costs. Why was John Ellis treated in the fashion he was by the Church's lawyers? I mean, that was unforgivable, wasn't it?
Yes, it was unforgivable.
I know what it is that the Cardinal wishes to say.
At his final appearance to date at the Royal Commission, Cardinal Pell apologised.
At the end of this gruelling appearance for both of us at this Royal Commission, I want publicly to say sorry to him for the hurt caused him by the mistakes made and admitted by me and some of my archdiocesan personnel during the course of the Towards Healing process and litigation.
Do you believe his apology was sincere?
I'm inclined to believe that he regrets taking that course. But I'm not really sure how much that has to do with being hauled before the Royal Commission and exposing the Church to the sort of scrutiny that it would rather avoid, and the door having been opened to that by how I was treated. I don't know the man personally. I don't know what's in his heart. I don't know if it really has any impact on him that people have been harmed by that. I certainly know at the time he was quite happy for me to be fodder for whatever the Church's objectives were.
Through the Gospel and the Eucharist...
John Ellis's case isn't a one-off. It followed a pattern of legal strategies adopted by Archbishop Pell in Victoria for dealing with the victims of the Church's worst child abusers. Among these men was Father Kevin O'Donnell, whose record of sexual assaults lasted nearly 50 years.
One solicitor who represented many victims of O'Donnell He called him the two-a-day man, so many crimes there.
And there seems to be evidence of offending in the mid-40s, going right through to, at least with our children, in the late 80s and early 90s. So it went on for an awful long time, and we're confident that the church knew about that offending happening along through those years.
Chrissy and Anthony Foster's daughters, Emma and Katie, were repeatedly raped by Father O'Donnell at Sacred Heart Primary School in Oakley in Outer Melbourne. Evidence that the church knew about Father O'Donnell from the very beginning comes from a man who, as a young altar boy, was abused by Father O'Donnell in the mid-1940s. The boy told his mother, who removed him from the school. She also informed the nuns, but Father O'Donnell was left in place.
What outcome could there have been if they had acted on that complaint?
Well, the course of history could have been changed if the church had responded to very early complaints about O'Donnell. And certainly other children who suffered throughout the course of time, such as the children of Mr. and Mrs. Foster, would not have been exposed to the risk of his sexual predation.
This letter, written by a priest in 1994 and shown tonight for the first time, reveals that as early as 1958, the Melbourne Archdiocese received a report regarding interfering by Kevin O'Donnell with a boy. The letter records that someone from the cathedral had come to see Kevin O'Donnell and also had talked to the boy. Everything was squared up since that time. In the ensuing decades, Father O'Donnell continued to commit crimes against children. In 1983, he baptised Katie Foster at Sacred Heart Church in Oakley. 6 years later, he was in high spirits at a confirmation service in Oakley when Emma Foster had been added to his long list of victims.
I'd just like to thank you very much, my Lord, for coming with us again. Make it a Sunday afternoon next time. We like Sunday afternoons, don't we? Because we can have a bit of a party afterwards. We like the chance for you to meet with the bishop when he comes.
I look forward to many more years of work from Father O'Donnell in the church here.
At Emma Foster's confirmation in 1993, her picture was taken with Bishop Pell. 3 years later, in an adolescent psychiatric unit, she disclosed that Father O'Donnell had sexually assaulted her.
The Fosters are just ordinary people. They live ordinary suburban lives. They were raising their children in the community. They didn't ask for this. This horror was visited upon them, not from out of the blue. This horror was visited upon them because the Archdiocese of Melbourne did not take earlier opportunities to investigate complaints that they had had against O'Donnell, to perhaps report matters to the police, and to take O'Donnell out of contact with children.
Francis Sullivan is CEO of the Truth, Justice and Healing Council, which speaks for the Church on matters related to the Royal Commission and child sexual abuse.
You heard the other day that the Pope said that about 2% of priests were pedophiles. Well, we think that figure is pretty low for what we estimate it to be in Australia, around maybe at least 4% of clergy, that's priests and religious, were child sex abusers.
That's a shocking percentage, isn't it?
Absolutely shocking. It's very confronting, actually.
Equally confronting for many victims has been the experience of going through the Church's internal complaints process in Victoria, known as the Melbourne Response, which was set up by George Pell when he became the city's Archbishop in 1996. The process has been highly controversial.
They promise things such as, we will get to the truth, we will address your needs, we will treat you with compassion and respect. And of course, once they arrive and by the time they've come through the process, It is anything but compassion, love and Christianity.
Chrissy and Anthony Foster experienced this for themselves when Archbishop Pell visited Oakley and met them shortly after setting up the Melbourne response.
His whole thrust was that the church wasn't liable for the actions of their priests. I was trying to get justice for our children at the time, and he was trying to prevent scandal to the church and trying to save the church's money. And we were in those two opposite corners. He was sitting in the big red chair, we were sitting on a hard wooden seat, being looked down upon by this powerful man of the church.
When the Fosters told Archbishop Pell what had happened to their daughter Emma, they were astounded by his response.
Well, he said to us, "I hope you can substantiate that in court." Now, it was a very strange comment because we had had some acceptance that this had happened from the church already, and yet he is taking the legal tack.
One thing the Fosters could immediately substantiate was the psychological damage that Father O'Donnell had inflicted on Emma. It came in the form of a photo.
He looked at a photo of Emma that we showed him where she'd cut her wrists, and he just looked at it and then said, "Oh, she's changed, hasn't she?" We thought he'd have some sympathy, some empathy. This shocking photo of anyone, of a child, anyone, with cut wrists sitting there, she was crying, and it didn't have any effect whatsoever on him. It was quite astounding. It just stunned us.
Please continue, Cardinal Pell.
Now, I understand people feel deeply about this.
Cardinal Pell gave his own explanation of what had occurred when he appeared at last year's Victorian inquiry into the handling of child abuse by religious organisations.
When Chrissy and Anthony Foster showed you a photograph after their daughter Emma had slashed her wrist, did you respond, and again I quote, "She's changed, hasn't she?"
Probably, but let's put this in context. Now, we know that was an attempted suicide. When you just look at a photo, suddenly, in front of you, how do you recognise just from the photo that this was an attempted suicide? Now, when you say, well, there's blood on the arms, sure, but you've got to understand that this was production of this photo was something sudden. I didn't have a chance for a considered response. I fully understood the enormity of the suffering.
The Fosters were one of the first families to go through Archbishop Pell's Melbourne response. It concluded with an offer of $50,000 to their daughter Emma and a letter of apology from Archbishop Pell. But as usual, it came with a catch. Enclosed was another letter from the church's lawyers, Cause Chambers Westgarth.
Well, that letter said that we should see the offer of $50,000 as an alternative to litigation that would be strenuously defended. So that was in the same envelope.
Which one more accurately depicted the church's real intent?
The letter from the lawyers, without doubt. The Archbishop's letter showed their position by offering a very small amount, and the letter from the lawyers, I think, recognised that we had a much greater claim, but they were going to fight it tooth and nail, and fight it they did.
Did the church and
Chrissy and Anthony Foster decided to meet the church head-on and take civil action.
It was the only way to get any sense of justice for our children and ourselves. It was as simple as that.
As would happen later in the John Ellis case, the church, through its lawyers, no longer admitted that Emma and Katie Foster had been abused by Father O'Donnell, even after the Archbishop's apology for what he had done.
Firstly, they disputed that the abuse had occurred, and then they denied that our daughters had suffered from that abuse. There's a pattern there of playing hardball, of playing legal games, of in fact in both the Ellis case and our children's cases of saying it didn't even happen, and if it did, you weren't harmed by it. There is that pattern there, and that pattern is an extension of what George Pell said to us in our meeting: if you don't like it, take it to court. So this is...
Nearly 10 years after starting their legal battle, the Fosters won a settlement of $750,000 plus costs, 10 times the maximum now payable under the Melbourne response. But under the terms of the agreement, the church required that this be kept confidential.
It was not an amount which I believe was just, but it gives a sense of what the church is willing to pay in order to keep people silent and to ensure that the case doesn't become public and that they don't, and that what they're willing to pay is not made public.
The Fosters achieved a substantial settlement by taking civil action against the church. But those victims who put their faith in the church's internal resolution process have ended up with a fraction of that amount in compensation. Robin Henderson disclosed her childhood abuse to the Melbourne response. Father Dominic Phillips was the priest who abused her when she attended St Joseph's Primary School in the Melbourne suburb of Malvern.
He'd sit me on his knee and he was looking into my eyes with a magnifying glass and telling me that I had one eye bigger than the other, and did I know? And while he was distracting me like that, his hands would wander. And I was abused by him manually. Anally and vaginally. And because he was a priest, I thought that was all right, but I felt uncomfortable. And I told the nun about it, and she said, "Oh, he's just being fatherly because he knows you haven't got a dad."
Father Phillips died in 1970 without ever being tried for the sex offences he's alleged to have committed. In 2009, the church accepted Robin Henderson's story and referred her to the Melbourne Response's compensation panel, which decides how much the church's victims will be paid.
My understanding is that...
When she visited the offices of the church's lawyers, Cause Chambers Westgarth, to talk to the panel by video link, she secretly recorded the remarks made to her by the panel's chair, David Curtin QC, about whether she needed a lawyer paid for by the church before signing a deed of release. Her recording is being played tonight for the first time.
I'm David Curtin. May I call you Robin?
I prefer title.
Thank you, Miss Henderson. That's fine. You have discussed with me in emails the provision of a lawyer to be provided by the church. I see that myself as something that's unnecessary because you'll be asked to sign a release, and the release is intended to release the church from any claim. So if you worked on the assumption that that was effective, then I myself struggle to see the point in having advice about that, unless that advice was to the effect that maybe the release isn't effective. Now, I'm not saying that it shouldn't be requested, but I hope that on analysis you can see the reason why we are of the view that it's an unnecessary item.
So I tell them that.
David Curtin has told Four Corners that he has never advised a victim not to seek legal advice before signing a release. When Robin Henderson insisted that she wanted a lawyer, David Curtin agreed to ask the church, and her legal bill of $1,100 was later paid for her. Robin Henderson was offered $30,000 in compensation, which reluctantly she accepted.
I didn't want to know any more after that. I was just depleted. I knew I had a good case. I knew I could have fought it if I wanted to, but I just didn't have the mental or the physical stamina to do it.
It's not just the victims of clergy sexual abuse who have suffered, it's also those who've tried to protect the victims. Graham Sleeman is a former Catholic school principal who lost his career after fighting to get the church to deal with a pedophile priest. Tonight, he's speaking out for the first time on national television.
What did other priests know? What did the Archbishop know? They knew lots, but sat on their hands.
In 1982, Graham Sleeman was appointed principal of Holy Family School in Doveton, part of the Archdiocese of Melbourne. It was a disadvantaged community, and history now shows it was also a town that was cursed with a succession of 4 pedophile priests between 1972 and 1997. The offending priests were Father Thomas O'Keefe, Father Wilfred Baker, Father Victor Rubeo, and Father Peter Searson.
This was a community that was perceived as low socioeconomics, poorly educated, wouldn't have the power or the tenacity or the willpower to complain to the authorities. So if we've got a problem, where do we send it? Would we send it to Toorak? I don't think so.
Doveton appears to be just a tragic example of the maladministration of the Catholic Church during that period, and people rightly should be enraged.
Graham Sleeman contends that in the case of Father Searson, the actions of the Church go well beyond maladministration. For 13 years after Father Searson arrived as parish priest in Doveton, parents, teachers and children reported that he was a child abuser.
You could almost call it a fetish that he had about having children go to confession to him, and they'd have to sit by him and kneel him, and they were the complaints that children brought to me about him and his behaviour. This particular day he had confession, and this young girl came screaming out of the church, and she was brought to me by her teacher, and she was inconsolable. And she had been interfered with by Searson in the confessional.
In 1986, 4 years after his appointment as principal, Graham Sleeman resigned to draw attention to what was happening. But his letter of resignation, he says, was censored by a church official in the Catholic Education Office.
I alleged that he had interfered with young girls at the school, and he had stolen money, and that he terrorised young boys.
And were you asked to take that out of your resignation letter?
You said I could not say that. I didn't have the proof.
In Doveton, Graham Sleeman's departure caused uproar, with parents at the school demanding that Father Searson be dismissed. But no action was taken against him by the church, and Searson himself remained unmoved. I have not been approached by either parents or teachers concerning any allegations. There's absolutely no truth or substance to them, he insisted. I'd take an oath on that to anyone. From then on, it was all downhill for Graham Sleeman and his wife Jenny, who also resigned from her job as a teacher at the school. To this day, neither of them have ever been given another job in Catholic education.
Oh, we took a massive financial beating over all this. We lost everything. And the only thing I've got left is my wife and my children.
And your integrity.
I hope I've got my integrity. I hope I have that. And that's the thing that I've been hopefully able to maintain.
So, Carmel, we're coming up to the school here on the right. How does it feel to be coming back after all those years?
Bit emotional, but you people are telling the story.
It really was a very traumatic experience for you, wasn't it?
Yeah, most definitely. Coloured my life ever since.
1 year after Graham Sleeman left Holy Family School, Carmel Rafferty arrived to take up a teaching post. From the start, she too was concerned about Father Searson. Teachers told her that the children needed protection from him. And then she heard it from the children themselves.
They were very loud and voluble, very upset, and they wanted protection from the priest. And I said, what is your concern? We don't want to serve on the altar. So I asked them why they didn't, what was the worst that could happen if they did serve on the altar? And they said, it's because of the way he touches us.
In 1990, Bishop Pell, who'd met a deputation of concerned teachers the year before, went to Doveton to consecrate Father Searson's new church. Our aim is to bring people back to God, Father Searson announced. Later, the teachers became so desperate that they sent a second deputation to Bishop Pell.
And it came to a head when the priest was going into the boys' toilets several times a day. And we more or less said, that's it. And the principal authorised the 3 Year 5-6 teachers to go in a deputation to Pell at the time.
The teachers asked Bishop Pell to remove Father Searson, but it didn't happen. Cardinal Pell defended his actions when he was challenged about this at last year's Victorian inquiry.
I met with at least on two occasions with groups of teachers from the Searson School. So I certainly didn't do nothing, I certainly did. I was sent back to Searson to tell him to follow the protocols correctly because people were saying he was misbehaving. Now, he was furious at that. He denied everything and anything.
Bishop Pell's instruction to Father Searson to follow the protocols correctly cut no ice with the priest. Not long afterwards, Carmel Rafferty heard a pupil's disclosure in a sex education class.
He rolled himself in a ball, sort of to hide himself, and he's saying, oh no, Father Searson's got a big penis. So we were very concerned.
After fruitlessly trying to get the church to act, Carmel Rafferty resigned in 1993. It would take the church another 4 years to act. In 1997, after the victim who had run screaming from the confessional came forward with her story, Father Searson was finally suspended as a parish priest by the new Archbishop of Melbourne, George Pell.
The police submission and action.
When Archbishop Pell set up the Melbourne response, he appointed Peter O'Callaghan QC as independent commissioner to investigate victims' claims and decide if they were justified. In 1997, he asked Mr. O'Callaghan to investigate the Doveton scandal. Graham Sleeman became a key witness. Over several years, Mr. O'Callaghan made regular, unconditional payments to Graham Sleeman, amounting in all to $90,000. Mr. O'Callaghan says the payments came out of his own pocket, and he did this out of compassion for Mr. Sleeman.
I contacted Mr. O'Callaghan and said, how do we survive? And he said, well, I'll support you. And he then sent once a month, equivalent to my weekly pay, which about a monthly payment was about $2,000.
In October 2005, Graham Sleeman received a settlement payment from the church of $150,000, forwarded to him by the church's lawyers, Cause Chambers Westgarth. But a condition of this payment was that he remain silent.
Was that money hush money?
Well, I believe it had to have been. Why else would they have done it? They did nothing to help me in the past, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, they come to it. I believe now, in strong reflection, that I was paid that sort of money to remain silent. My interpretation of the deed of release was, if I accepted the $150,000, I could neither say what I received and what took place for me to receive that. So all the information I had about Doveton and so forth and so on was to remain confidential.
Just from your evidence, can you understand how victims regard what happened during this period as there was really hear no evil, see no evil, say nothing about evil from the church?
I think so. That's an objectionable suggestion with no foundation in the truth, and no conviction was recorded for Searson on sexual misbehaviour. There might be victims.
But tonight, Four Corners can reveal that in an internal church hearing, the priest was found guilty of child sexual abuse. This confidential draft report by Peter O'Callaghan, shown tonight for the first time, reveals that even before he went to Doveton, Father Searson achieved a regrettable record of suspected sexual abuse of children and considerable financial misappropriations. Mr. O'Callaghan records that in an internal hearing in 1997, he made a finding that the parish priest had been guilty of sexual abuse. But astonishingly, Father Searson successfully appealed to the congregation in Rome, which held that Mr. O'Callaghan did not have appropriate jurisdiction or procedure to make the findings he did against Father Searson.
The priest had rung Rome and spoken to a canon lawyer and claimed that he didn't have to leave.
There is now a third whistleblower who's come forward to reveal what went on inside the Archdiocese when the Doveton scandal was unfolding. Helen Last was director of the Church's Pastoral Response Office, answering to Vicar General Dennis Hart, now Archbishop of Melbourne, when she was contacted in 1997 by worried parishioners from Doveton.
One of the major things that they were grappling with was, how could our church have known that this priest was a paedophile, Father Searson, and others before him, and not done anything to help us? I decided in all conscience that I would go and spend the day with them. But I had been told in a phone message prior to going by Vicar General Hart that I needn't pay any attention to Doveton, I needn't respond. I also received a letter from him that I recall instructing me not to go.
She also received a letter from Archbishop Pell telling her that the situation at Doveton was under control and that there remains no need for any proactive measures by your office.
Now, when you went
Helen Last disobeyed Archbishop Pell's instructions and went to Doveton. 1 month later, she was out of a job. The day she spent there was an emotional one.
I spent the day with these people who cried, who raged, who shook their fists, who held each other, and who were utterly lost in the situation and wanted me to point them towards a way of doing something about what had been visited upon them.
Well, Doveton, like every other community, every other Catholic parish or school community, deserves to see the church today make atonement for the past.
The sins of the fathers have lasting consequences for victims and their families, but the Church itself has often failed to recognise this. In 1999, Katie Foster, who'd been drinking, was hit by a car and remains profoundly disabled. In 2008, Emma Foster took her own life. But when Father Searson died, 15 priests and a bishop from the Melbourne Archdiocese gathered to pay their respects. These photos were taken by Chrissy and Anthony Foster. They want the Church to let us see the whole picture.
The Royal Commission here, to do its job properly, needs all the documents associated with all the sexual assault complaints and all the priests that have carried those out in Australia that it knows of. We need all the documents to ensure that we see the whole picture. And of course, the Catholic Church does not want us to see the whole picture. That's the problem.
I guess we can have some sense of what a victim loses after the kind of abuse we've now heard such a great deal about. I wonder how the Church measures what it's lost, or indeed thrown away. The Archbishop of Melbourne, Dennis Hart, David Curtin QC and Peter O'Callaghan QC all declined to be interviewed by Four Corners because they said they will soon be appearing at the Royal Commission hearings in Melbourne. Cardinal Pell has also declined to be interviewed. Next week on Four Corners, the battle over the Great Barrier Reef, testing claims by scientists, tourism operators and environmentalists that the reef is at risk, as UNESCO considers whether to place it on the World Heritage in Danger list. Until then, good night. If this program has raised issues of concern, you might like to call one of these numbers: